So let's start off by talking about the oral cavity and the contents in there. First off, the mouth, that's the first part of the alimentary canal. It is there for several reasons. We use it to eat or ingest food. It also helps in mastication or chewing, which is the mechanical breakdown of the solid food that we eat. It is also important to mix that food with saliva. But remember that the mouth has other functions besides just related to eating and digestion. It is an organ of speech. Okay, it also has taste buds, so it is a sensory organ as well for special senses. The oral cavity is surrounded on the sides by the cheek and at the orifice or in the entrance by the lips. And the mouth includes the oral cavity and the vestibule. The vestibule is that area between the lip and the gums. For the cheeks, those make the lateral sides of the oral cavity. Okay, they're made out of skin and fat, and more importantly, it includes muscles for facial expression and some muscles for mastication. On the inside, it is lined by a mucous membrane to produce mucus, which is basically stratified squamous epithelium with goblet cells in order to make mucus. The lips, that is the boundary between the skin on the outside and the mucous membrane on the inside. It is important because it has sensory receptors that kind of judge the temperature and texture of food before we eat. The tongue is made out of skeletal muscle fibers. It occupies the floor of the mouth, and it actually occupies the most of the oral cavity when the mouth is closed. There is a lingual frenulum, and that is an extension of mucous membrane that connects the tongue to the floor of the mouth. On the top of the tongue, you'll find all of these papillae, and that we know now that those have your taste buds. All the way towards the back of the tongue, very deep towards the back of the throat, you'll find tonsils, and those are known as the lingual tonsils. On either side of the tongue, you will find another pair of tonsils known as the palatine tonsils. So by default, when we say that somebody had a tonsillectomy or removed their tonsils, we're actually talking about these palatine tonsils, but we do have other tonsils, and we're going to talk about that as well. The palate is the roof of the oral cavity. Okay, there is a hard palate, and that's made out of bone. It makes the anterior part of the palate. And then towards the back, there is a soft palate that is made out of muscles. At the very tip of the soft palate, there is a part that's kind of dangling into the oral cavity. You could see it if you open up your mouth. There's that little uvula in there. Okay, so the uvula is an extension of the soft palate. Now, a couple of tonsils that we could see here, and if you're not familiar with what tonsils are part of the lymphatic system. They have lymphatic tissue, and again, they're going to try to trap pathogens as they try to enter, whether through the oral cavity or the respiratory tract. So we've already introduced the palatine tonsils, which are on either sides of the tongue. This right here is the tongue, and you can see all the way in the back, those are your lingual tonsils. We also have what are known as the pharyngeal tonsils, and those are all the way in the back of the pharynx. When they are enlarged or inflamed, we name them adenoids. Now for the teeth are the hardest structures in the body. They are harder than bones. Okay, in kids have 20 primary or deciduous teeth. Also, we kind of commonly call them milk teeth. Okay, so 20 primary teeth, 10 on the top and 10 on the bottom. While adults have 32 secondary or permanent teeth, 16 on the top and 16 on the bottom. What we are looking at here is our teeth in a kid, and we know that because you can see some of the teeth that are in the oral cavity, while others were still in the making here in mandibular bone or in the maxillary bone, okay, upper jaw and lower jaw. And those teeth will eventually grow and push those primary teeth so that they would fall and replace them. And important for both lecture and lab would be to know the different names of the teeth. Okay, so again, there's 16 on the top on the maxillary jaw and 16 in the mandible, or the lower jaw. So we will find, we want to name them, okay, 8 on each side. So if you kind of imagine a midline right here, and here again you could see the uvula and you could see the 2 palatine tonsils. So for the teeth names from medial, we have the 2 incisors. There's a medial and a lateral one. And then followed by 1 canine, also known as a cuspid tooth. And then we have 2 premolars, also known as bicuspid. And then 3 molars, first, second, and third molar. That third molar tooth is also known as the wisdom tooth. We take a look at the section of the tooth. There's a part of the tooth that is embedded or found in that socket. The socket in the jaw is known as the alveolar process. Okay, and the part of the tooth that we do not see is known as the root. Part of the tooth that we can see is the crown. The crown is formed out of the enamel, and the enamel is the part of the tooth that we lose due to wear and tear, whether it is, munching on something that is a little bit too hard, or whether we grind our teeth as we sleep. That enamel is the part that kind of wears off. Underneath the enamel, we'll find dentin, and dentin is actually very similar in structure to bone, but it is actually even harder than bone. So dentin is the hardest structure that we have in the body. Okay. The tooth is then wedged, as we mentioned, in the jaw, and you can find here that in order to make sure that that tooth does not fall, there are these little tiny periodontal ligaments that hold the tooth in place, and embedded within a protein matrix known as cementum that literally cements the tooth in there. So what keeps the tooth in place are these periodontal ligaments and cementum, and obviously as we age, they tend to become weaker, and teeth can actually fall as we age due to the weakening of these ligaments and cementum. You can also see the gums or the gingiva, and what is notable here is that cavity found in the middle of the tooth, and that is known as the root canal. Okay, so you find here the blood vessels and the nerve coming into that to that tooth through the root canal. In order for when a cavity happens, it erodes the enamel, then the dentin, and if it reaches all the way into the pulp or the pulp cavity, or this is when these nerves are going to be stimulated, and that is why eating or drinking something that is really cold or too hot will start to become painful. Now, what are dental caries or cavities? Okay, cavities happen inside of the enamel of the tooth. Again, it could go deeper into the dentin all the way down to the nerves. It is formed because sticky food or food just remains in the oral cavity. When we swallow them, there are parts that are going to remain in there, whether in between the teeth or, and the gums and so on, especially all the way in the back in the molars where, especially if we brush our teeth, that we don't really reach those areas very well. And because the food will remain there, bacteria will break them down and metabolize them into sugar and into acids, and it's the acid that really starts to destroy the enamel and dentin. So how do we prevent dental cavities from happening? Well, the ADA, or the American Dental Association, says that we have to brush and floss daily, dental exams every 6 months and cleanings, fluoride treatments, and sealants if needed. The salivary glands, those glands make saliva. they help in, the saliva is made out of two different parts. It's like a watery part that has the digestive enzymes and a mucus portion to it. And the mucus portion is going to help in moisturizing and kind of sticking everything together into the bolus, and that we are able to swallow after chewing it. Okay, so saliva helps in dissolving food so that it can be tasted. Remember when we talked about taste receptors, we said that they are chemical receptors, where we would have to change the chemistry of saliva in order for us to taste things. So again, saliva is there to dissolve food so that it can be tasted. Saliva has enzymes, okay, especially salivary amylase, and that is the very first step in digestion of carbohydrates. And it also has bicarbonate ions. That is going to keep the pH on the alkalinic side. It helps to keep, the salivary amylase needs an alkalinic medium in order for it to act. And it also protects the food against that acidic byproducts that were made by bacteria. We have 3 pairs of major salivary glands. There are the parotid glands by the ear, the submandibular glands under the mandible, and the sublingual glands under the tongue. And there's a right and left, so there's a pair of each of these. And just very recently, there were what are known as tubular glands that were also discovered. And glad enough, I guess, that in this version, we do not go into details about it because, again, it was very recently discovered. There are other minor glands that are scattered throughout the mucosal lining, whether it's in the oral cavity, on the inside of the cheeks, up on the palate, and so on. Salivary secretions, as I already mentioned, there are 2 different types because there are 2 different cells in the salivary glands. There are serous cells, and those produce a very watery fluid rich in the digestive enzyme known as salivary amylase. And amylase, again, is the very first step to digest carbohydrates, whether they're starch or glycogen, into a disaccharide. So starch and glycogen are polysaccharides, and again, to digest it into a disaccharide made out of 2 sugar units only, salivary amylase will help in performing that. It doesn't complete it, but I mean, some polysaccharide molecules kind of bypass that and would have to be digested by other amylases. Okay, but this would be the first step to where it could happen. There are also mucus cells that make mucus. Okay, again, it'll bind to these food particles, lubricate the process, especially when we're swallowing. Xerostomia is a condition also known as dry mouth, where there is the decrease in the amount of saliva that is being produced by the glands or a total lack of it. It may be due to age. More commonly, it is also due to a disease that destroyed the glands, for example, systemic lupus, erythematosus, or just commonly known as lupus, or rheumatoid arthritis. Those 2 diseases are systemic diseases where in some patients lead to the destruction of their salivary glands. So the major salivary glands that we know of, or that we're going to be learning about at least, are the parotids, sublingual, and submandibular gland. And I would like to use the image in order to explain it. For each gland, you want to know where it is, what kind of secretion does it mainly secrete, so is it serous or mucus or a mixture of both, and where do the ducts open into the oral cavity to kind of dump the saliva in. So the first one is the parotid gland. This is the biggest of all of the salivary glands. It is found inferior and in front of the ear. It produces mainly a serous saliva, very rich in salivary amylase. And you can see the parotid duct as it crosses over the masseter muscle and then perforates the buccinator muscle. It opens up in the oral cavity opposite to the second upper molar tooth. Next, we have the sublingual gland, and from the name, it is telling you that it is underneath the tongue, and that's exactly where it is. It's underneath the tongue. That right here is the tongue. It makes a very mucus saliva. It's a very thicker kind of saliva, full of mucus. And you can see here that it is not just one duct, but it has multiple ducts, and all of them open up underneath the tongue and the floor of the mouth. The submandibular gland is found in the floor of the oral cavity. It is, related to the submandibular, to the mandible. It kind of hugs the mandible, and you could find the submandibular duct. The kind of saliva that this gland secretes is a mixture of both serous and mucus saliva. It has one duct that will open up in the floor of the cavity on either sides of the frenulum. So this, again, is the frenulum. If you look in the mirror, you'll find two openings on either side. Those are the openings of the submandibular gland. Okay, and this ends that portion. I will see you in the next.